The wind scraped across the dried bones of Dry Creek Junction like it was trying to erase the town from the map, and Eunice Calderon felt like it had nearly succeeded. She stood at her stovetop, stirring a pot of thin broth with a slowness born of habit, not purpose. The wood of the spoon creaked against the tin pot with every circle, a rhythm that matched the groan of the rafters overhead. Outside, dust blew sideways across the valley, catching on rusted nail heads and drifting into the seams of windows long since warped by sun and time. Inside her shack, the only warmth came from the fire under the stew and the old mutt snoring near the hearth. In the corner, next to her cast-iron skillet, sat a rusted tin. Inside was a folded scrap of paper, the corners browned with age and handling. She hadn't looked at it in years, but she remembered every curve of the handwriting, her mother's slanted script, sweet as molasses in memory. The paper held a recipe for cinnamon rolls, ones she hadn't dared try to make since the world taught her. Sweetness was a risk best avoided. Eunice ladled out a spoonful of broth into a cracked bowl. She didn't taste it. There wasn't much point. It was turnip water and regret. No salt, no meat, no dreams. That day, the wind carried more than sand. It brought boots to her door. A knock rattled the warped wood, sudden and strange. She hadn't had a visitor in 3 weeks, and that had only been the traveling preacher looking for a place to sleep and not keen to linger. Her first thought was a debt she didn't owe. Her second, a mistake. She opened the door a crack. Standing there was Sheriff Clanton, red-nosed and swaying slightly. He held his battered hat to his chest and wore the look of a man doing a duty he didn't enjoy. "Afternoon, Miss Calderon," he drawled. "Sheriff," she said, flat. He shifted. "There's going to be a dance at the meeting hall next week. One of them community things. Ladies bring in pies and such. Thought you might want to, feel part of it." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that a request or a warning?" He chuckled awkwardly. "Just figured you might want to show face. Folks might warm up to you." "I've made peace with Knott," she said, and started to shut the door. He opened his mouth like he might say something soft or pitiful, but she closed it before he could give her a reason to hate him. She stared at the door for a moment longer than necessary, then turned back inside, the spoon still resting in the pot. The fire had begun to die. She didn't add more wood, a pie for the town dance. She could already hear the laughter, the way the banker's daughter would clutch her lace and pretend Eunice's offering was quaint, how the boys would make bets about who'd pretend to flirt with her for a dare. They'd done it before. A lifetime ago, when she still wore her hair in braids and dared bring gingerbread to a harvest fair. They'd mocked her then. She'd let them. Not anymore. That night, long after the fire had gone out and the stew had turned to cold skin in the pot, something deeper than anger stirred in her chest. Not fire, not really. Just old coals shifting beneath the ash. A weight that had sat too long. A heaviness that whispered, "You're still here." So the next morning, she laced her cracked leather boots, took her basket, and left. The path led through brittle scrub and low thorns, past the crumbled foundation of the schoolhouse that had burned in '79. No one walked this way anymore. The trail had been swallowed by weeds and snake holes, but Eunice remembered the way. Up near Widow's Gulch, if you climbed down by the creek, there were berries. Not many knew. Not many cared. But if you went early, before the birds got bold, they were plump and blood-red. Enough for a pie. Maybe 2. The sun bore down by mid-morning, relentless and high, casting hard shadows that made rocks look like crouching men. The smell of dust mixed with something sweet, honeysuckle maybe, or wild mint, though she couldn't see any. Her dress snagged on branches more than once. She didn't mind. Reaching the creek, she paused. The water moved slow but clear, trickling over stones that looked like old teeth. Kneeling, she dipped her hands in. The cold shocked her bones. She sat there a moment, breathing, listening. Then she began to gather. Her fingers moved quick and careful, pulling the ripe ones free and leaving the rest. She hummed, low and tuneless, just for herself. The silence broke. Whiskey, her dog, growled low. He stood stiff-legged near a tree, nose pointed into the brush. She stilled, listened. The rustling came again, too heavy for a rabbit, too slow for a snake. She turned, heart hammering. Out from the bramble emerged a wild boar. It was massive. Its hide bristled with mud and burrs, eyes dark and locked onto her. Its tusks gleamed as it snorted and pawed the earth. 30 feet, maybe less. She didn't scream. That wasn't her way. She dropped the berries, grabbed the thickest stick she could find, and stepped in front of the dog. The boar charged. She swung. Wood met flesh with a sickening crack. The beast squealed, not in retreat, but in rage, and wheeled again. She stumbled, nearly lost her footing on the slick creek stones. It came again. She ran, ducking behind a boulder, lungs burning. Her knife was in her apron, small, dull, useless. But she pulled it anyway, because that's what you do when dying isn't something you've got time for. The boar lowered its head, ready, and then came the shot. It cracked the air like judgment. The boar jerked, staggered, and collapsed into the dirt. Blood pooled fast, dark and steaming. Dust settled, and then a voice, light and warm and unexpected. "Ma'am, you all right?" She turned. A figure on horseback emerged from the trees. He was young, no older than 25, tall in the saddle, sun-browned skin and eyes the color of riverbed stones. He dismounted with the ease of someone who didn't fear much. "Hell of a morning," he said, slinging his rifle back. "You pick a fight with death or just bad luck?" She looked at the dead boar, then at him. "Both, maybe." He chuckled. "Brave." "Stupid," she corrected. He nodded. "Best kind." She stood, brushing herself off. "Didn't need rescuing." He looked at the knife in her hand, raised a brow. "Sure seemed like you had it handled, with that butter blade and a tree branch." She couldn't help it. She laughed, quick, sharp, and surprised. "Could have stabbed it a few times before it gored me." He extended a hand. "Silas Baird." Her stomach turned at the name. Baird. Everyone knew the Bairds, ranching family that owned most everything west of the Salt Flats. Edric Baird, Silas's father, was the kind of man who bought loyalty like cattle and expected bloodlines to stay clean and obedient. She didn't say her name right away. Instead, she wiped her palm on her skirt before shaking his. "Eunice," she said finally. "Eunice Calderon." His eyes didn't flicker with recognition. Maybe he hadn't heard the stories. Maybe he didn't know she was the woman townsfolk joked about after 2 drinks too many. Good. "What are you doing way out here?" she asked, glancing at the path. "Escaping," he said honestly. "Exploring. Bit of both." "You lost?" "Nope. Just not in a hurry to be found." He offered her a canteen. "Water. It's a polite thing, I'm told." She drank. He watched her without judgment. No smirks, no sideways glances at her hips. Just watching. "I'd offer you some stew," she said when she handed the canteen back. "But it's mostly turnip and regret." He laughed. "Best I ever had was squirrel whiskey and shame." "So I ain't picky." They talked, about nothing important. But something in her chest cracked a little, like a window stuck too long in winter finally giving way to the spring air. When the sun dipped behind the ridge, he stood to go. "Will I see you again?" he asked. She narrowed her eyes. "Planning on rescuing more women from boars?" "I was thinking I might help fix your roof, if you got one that leaks." She hesitated. "You don't know who I am." "Do I need to?" She said nothing. He smiled, mounted his horse, and turned toward the trail. "I'll bring nails," he said over his shoulder. "Maybe flour, if you bake." "I used to," she said softly. "Well," he said, tipping his hat, "let's see if you remember how." And then he rode off, the dead boar between them. The berries crushed in the dirt, and the last light of day, turning gold behind him. Eunice stood a long time after he was gone. The wind whispered through the grass. Whiskey circled her legs. She'd long thought herself past beginnings. But something had shifted. No one had looked at her like that in years. Not like a burden. Not like a dare. Not like a woman. And for the first time in a long, long while, Eunice Calderon didn't feel like she was waiting to die. She felt like something was about to begin. He tipped his hat, eyes still on her. "I'll bring nails next time. Maybe flour too, if you bake." And before Eunice could answer, he was already riding into the glare of the sun like some damn miracle that wasn't supposed to stop for women like her. The next time Silas Baird showed up, it was just after sunrise, and Eunice still had flour on her hands from a recipe she didn't believe would work. She'd woken before the sun, and Woodsy, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, pulled out that old recipe scrap from the tin beside her stove. It had softened over the years, the ink faded, but legible. She read it slowly, lips moving with the words, tracing her mother's curves and slanted loops with the pads of her fingers. There was no cinnamon in the house. She substituted clove and a pinch of wild mint she'd dried last spring. The dough came together like old hands learning a forgotten hymn, stiff at first, then forgiving. It made her think of her mother, and for the first time in many winters, she let herself remember that woman's humming and the warmth of an oven they hadn't owned in decades. As she stood by the fire, rolling out the dough on a flatboard balanced atop an upturned crate, the unmistakable sound of hooves cracked through the morning stillness. She turned just as Silas dismounted. "Morning, Miss Calderon," he said with that crooked grin, as if they were old friends meeting on a porch and not two strangers tangled in fate. She blinked at him, hand still dusted in flour. "You remembered my name?" He raised an eyebrow. "Well, when a woman nearly kills a boar with a stick, it tends to stay with a man." She tried not to smile. She failed. "You really came back?" He held up a burlap sack. "I brought flour, like I promised, and nails. Figured we could test your oven and maybe patch up a leak or two." The words shouldn't have meant anything, but they did. She stepped aside. "Hope you're not expecting anything fancy. Most of my recipes died of neglect." The cabin looked cleaner than it had in years. Sparse, yes, and full of worn things, but there was order, and the fire burned steady. Her hands moved quickly, almost too quickly, pulling the dough into spirals and setting it by the hearth. Silas set the sack on the table, glanced around. "You fix the shutters," he said casually. "I fix what I can," she replied, kneading the dough with deliberate weight. "Been poor since before it was fashionable." He leaned against the doorframe, folding his arms. "I'm not here out of pity, Eunice." She looked up. "I'm here because I want to be." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, though, like a fresh snowfall no one had stepped through yet. After a moment, he rolled up his sleeves. "Need help with anything?" "The dough might not rise," she warned. "Neither did mine the first dozen times," he said. "Good thing I never gave up." They worked side by side, quiet at first. She gave instructions. He followed them with a patience she hadn't expected. He was useless at shaping the rolls, but he fetched water, tended the fire, and didn't once ask why her hands trembled. The first batch was inedible, dense as stone, and sour. They laughed as they spat it out near the creek. "Deadliest biscuit I ever met," he said, holding his stomach. The second batch fared better. The third filled the house with a scent that felt dangerously like hope. When she pulled it from the coals, steam rising, they each tore off a piece. It wasn't perfect, but it was warm, soft. "Still got it?" he asked, mouth full. "That was me," she said. "Your contribution was burning the first two." He leaned closer. "Every good baker needs an assistant to ruin things once in a while. Keeps her humble." She snorted, but her heart, that old stubborn thing, thudded differently. The day wore on. He stayed. They talked over coffee that tasted faintly of dirt, but felt luxurious in its shared warmth. Outside, the sun painted the valley gold, and then faded into the hush of dusk. The fire crackled. Whiskey dozed at their feet. They sat beneath the crooked oak tree just outside her door, the sky turning amber behind the hills, bread cooling on the windowsill behind them. "You ever feel like everything people expect of you is just wrong?" he asked. She glanced at him. "Most of my life." He nodded. "My father wants me to take over the ranch, marry the banker's daughter, breathe cattle dust and count coin until I rot. You don't want that." He shook his head. "I want this." He gestured toward the loaf. The air around them smelled of earth, of baking, of sweat and pine and slow-earned peace. "I want to build something," he said. "Not inherit it. Something warm, something real." Eunice stared at her flour-dusted hands. "And you think you can get that with me?" "I think," he said slowly, "you're the first person I've met who doesn't wear a mask." She looked at him. Really looked. "You say what you mean. You fight for yourself. That's rare." She swallowed. "I'm not what they want for you." He met her gaze without flinching. "I'm not what they want either." The silence stretched. "I'm older," she murmured. "You're rich. You think that matters to me?" "I think it matters to them." "I'm not asking them." The emotion came fast and uninvited. Her throat tightened. She looked away, blinking hard. "I'm not soft," she whispered. "I won't make life easy. I don't want easy. I want you." It shouldn't have hit so deep, but it did. "I loved someone once," she said finally. "Years ago. Said he didn't care what people thought. Said he'd marry me. Then he left. Married a girl half my size, with hair like corn silk. Told me it was a kindness." Silas didn't speak for a while. Then he reached out and took her hand. "I don't have corn silk hair," he said quietly. "But I've got hands that know how to hold on." Her heart broke and healed in the same second. They sat there as the stars came out, her fingers wrapped in his, the firelight dancing on their skin. She didn't say yes. Not yet. But she didn't pull away either. When he stood to leave, he lingered near the door, saddlebag in hand. "Mind if I stop by again?" She studied his face. Honest. Weathered already, despite his youth. Not polished like his kin. Not arrogant like town boys. "You can bring more flour," she said, "and try not to burn the first two." He smiled wide. "Deal." And then he was gone, footsteps crunching through the dusk. She watched him disappear down the trail. The night folded around her. The cabin smelled of yeast and wood smoke. She closed the door, leaned against it. Somehow she was still holding the last roll. She didn't eat it. She held it, because it meant something had risen, something long buried. And she wasn't quite ready to let go. That soft sound of hoofbeats echoing away faded into silence. She didn't light the lamp. She didn't need to. She sat in the dark, her hand warm around that small risen piece of proof. She didn't know what would come next, but she was no longer waiting to disappear. She was waiting to rise. And in the quiet, she smiled. He stepped back, breath trembling. "They'll come for you." Silas met her gaze without flinching. "Let them." The first time someone spit the name Baird outside Eunice's cabin, it wasn't Silas who flinched. It was her. She'd been kneeling on the porch, elbow deep in a bowl of rising dough, when she heard it. A boy's voice, loud and high with mean laughter, slinging the name like it was filth. A Baird with the bread hag! Then the thump of a thrown stone bouncing off her fence rail, and silence. Just the wind afterward, pretending it hadn't carried cruelty. The voice faded into the heat haze, but it stayed with her long after the dust settled. 2 mornings before, she'd caught Silas humming in the backyard while mending her rain barrel, and he'd pulled a note from his coat, an old letter from his brother, Lang. It was unsigned, but she knew the tone. Cruel in that educated way, always just one word short of a threat. It said, "You're not meant for scraps and flour. Father's patience has its edge." She remembered warning him then. She could see herself clearly in that moment, standing by the chopped kindling pile, her apron dusted with flour and sweat, saying, "They'll come looking, and not with kindness." Now they had begun. The chapter's tension started in the market square. Eunice had gone with Silas to buy thread and salt. He walked beside her openly, offering his arm. The sun cast long beams down between the shuttered buildings, where whispers lived. Her steps slowed when she noticed the glances, some quick and guilty, others deliberate and sharp. One of the Cooper boys snickered near the store porch, and Mrs. Ferris, who once bought jam from Eunice's mother, turned her head away. Eunice stiffened. Silas noticed. "Let 'em look," he said, voice quiet but sure. "It's not their eyes I mind," she replied, jaw clenched. "It's the stories they'll make." Still he walked tall, bought her a spool of blue thread and a tin of pepper, paid in coin and smile. And when they passed the church steps, he stopped to offer old Reverend Lyle a nod and a respectful tip of his hat. The Reverend, to his credit, nodded back. But the town was shifting, and not toward them. That evening, she found her best dress missing from the line behind the cabin. The clothespins lay in the dirt. The tracks around them weren't hard to read. Youth, heavy boots, more than one. Mischief made with malice. She didn't tell Silas. Not that night. She baked in silence, hands working faster than her mind, shaping rolls until her knuckles ached. The smell of rising dough almost soothed her, until she stepped out to fetch firewood just before dusk. That's when she saw it. Out in the field, where her scarecrow stood crooked and forgotten, someone had made a new decoration. Her missing dress had been tied around its stuffed torso, loosely, mockingly. On the neck, where she'd once placed an old bonnet, now rested the boiled clean skull of a pig. Its grin gleamed in the dying sun, teeth too white against the cloth. Whiskey growled. Eunice said nothing. She walked over, untied the dress with deliberate hands, and carried the whole thing to the fire pit. She burned it while the bread cooled. The next morning, Silas saw the ashes. He didn't ask. He just looked at the char and the warped buttons still visible in the soot. His shoulders tightened. His eyes darkened, not with shame, but something older. Grief, maybe, or fury dressed in Sunday clothes. "Who?" he asked. She shrugged. "Town's got plenty of ghosts." He knelt beside her. "We need to leave." She folded her arms. "This is your home," he added softly. "This is my prison." He touched her hand. "Come with me, Eunice. North. I've got coin set aside, more than enough to build a shop, a real oven, a clean start." She didn't answer right away. The wind kicked up. The sky had the dull sheen of coming heat. "I'm 37, she said finally. "I've got more years behind me than ahead. And you could have any life." "I don't want any life," he said, voice steady. "I want the one with you." It would have been easier if he'd sounded desperate, if he'd trembled, but he didn't. He said it like he was asking the weather to turn warm and trusted it would. Still, a part of her resisted. Not out of doubt in him, but doubt in the world. The part that remembered the way promises rot. That night they sat on the porch, the moon hanging low and gold above the ridgeline. Fire crackled in the stove behind them. Whiskey snored softly. Eunice spoke without looking at him. "I loved someone once," she said. Silas didn't interrupt. He said I was worth the fight, that he'd stand beside me. But when the fight came, he folded. Married a girl half my size with skin like porcelain and family money stacked high. He said it was a kindness, said I deserved better than ridicule. Silas said nothing for a long time. Then, finally, he was a coward. "I believed him," she whispered. "I thought maybe he was right. Maybe I was only meant to be alone." He turned toward her. "I don't have porcelain skin," he said, "but I've got hands that know how to hold on." She looked at those hands, calloused, dirt under the nails. Strong. "You really want to marry me?" she asked. "More than anything." The wedding happened quietly. 3 mornings later. No church, no guests. Just Father Lyle from a town over, a mule-drawn wagon carrying a dusty Bible, and the field behind the cabin full of wild clover and dry grass. Eunice wore a dress sewn from old curtain panels. Silas wore his best shirt and a tie that wouldn't sit straight. Whiskey barked when the vows were said, like he was announcing something sacred. And Eunice cried, not out of sorrow or fear, but because life had finally handed her something soft. But softness never stays untouched. That very night, while they packed the few things they could carry, a rock shattered the front window. The sound split the cabin in two. Glass sprayed across the floor. A note tied with twine to the rock unfurled where it landed. "Leave or we'll bury her." Silas grabbed his rifle. "No," Eunice said, voice like iron. "We don't fight them here." "I'm not letting them drive us out," he spat. "They won't bury me," she said. "Not if we don't give them the ground." By morning, they were gone. They rode north before the sun cracked the horizon. Through canyons and over ridges, following deer paths and old trade routes, crossing creeks swollen from last week's rain. They rode by night, slept by day, ate stale bread, shared coffee brewed bitter over smoky fires. Silas carried her when her feet blistered. She hunted rabbits when his shoulder stiffened. They didn't talk much on the trail, not because they were afraid, but because they already knew everything that mattered. One afternoon, as clouds piled thick above the peaks, they stopped beside a wide river. Silas stared across the water, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" she asked. He pointed to the bark of a nearby tree, a single diagonal slash. "My brother's here," he said, voice low. "Lang." Her blood ran cold. "How do you know?" "That mark." "We used it to track cattle. It means I passed this way." She gripped the rifle tighter. "You regret it?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Not one damn second." They rode on that night in silence, through falling rain and wind that howled like a lost hymn. The world narrowed to hooves and breath and heartbeat, and when they made camp, their only shelter a sagging tarp stretched between pines, Eunice curled into his side and whispered, "You still want that bakery?" He laughed, even as the rain dripped from his hair. "More than ever. Then we'll build it." He pulled her closer, and despite the ache in their bones, despite the damp, despite the fear, they slept like people who had chosen each other over everything else. A distant owl called. The river whispered secrets to the stones, and the trees stood tall, guarding them. She swept the glass into her apron and whispered without turning, "We run, Silas. Or we bury them first." The cabin was still warm from the bread they baked when Silas vanished without a sound, and Eunice woke to find only hoofprints and silence. Morning broke cold and gray, the kind of cold that settled into old joints and lingered even after the sun rose. The small room still smelled of the honey rolls they'd pulled from the hearth the night before, the sweet scent clinging to her hands even as she reached across the bed for warmth and found nothing. Silas's side of the blanket was cold. She sat up slowly, blinking against the dawn. At first she thought he might have stepped out for water or to check the traps. He was often gone early, always trying to do more than his share. But when she opened the cabin door, the air was still. His horse was gone. No note. No sound but the wind in the trees and whiskey whining low from the foot of the bed. She stepped out barefoot, the damp earth biting at her soles. The trail in front of the cabin had fresh hoofprints, deeper than Silas's usual ride, messier, as if someone had struggled. She followed them with her eyes toward the tree line. There, just beyond the edge of their clearing, something shifted. Whiskey trotted ahead, his nose pressed low. Eunice followed, her heart a dull hammer in her chest. She moved slow, steady, the way her father taught her before he died. Back when tracking was something she did for rabbits and lost goats, not husbands. Near the brush, she found a scuffed boot print, one that dragged, then another, then a patch of disturbed pine needles where someone had been knocked down. She knelt beside it, fingers tracing the soft indentions, feeling the damp where blood had darkened the dirt. She stared at the broken twig still swinging, her breath shallow. Silas hadn't left. He'd been taken. And someone, two someones, judging by the prints, had done it while she slept just a wall away. She stood. Her chest felt tight. Rage blooming slow and deep. "Stay," she told Whiskey, voice low but sharp. Back inside, she grabbed what little she needed, a strip of salted jerky, her old hunting knife, the rusted tin where she kept her bullets, a handful of nails, because her father always said a woman should never ride without them. Sharp things had more than one use. She saddled her mare, tied her coat tight, and rode with her jaw set like stone. The trail wound deep into the pines, twisting through ravines and over creeks swollen from last week's rains. The air was thick with mist, branches dripping. The cries of ravens echoed above, and once she saw a fox dart between the trees, its red coat flashing like a warning. Hours passed. Her thighs burned. Her hands ached. Still she rode. The deeper she went, the clearer the tracks became. Whoever had taken him wasn't careful. They didn't think anyone would follow. But they didn't know Eunice Calderon. By late afternoon, the wind shifted. She smelled smoke, wood smoke, thick and greasy. She tied her mare to a birch and moved on foot, careful, silent. Through the brush ahead, she saw them. A fire burned low in a rocky clearing. Two men sat beside it. One was tall and lean, with the kind of clean-shaven face that made women uneasy and a tongue sharp enough to gut. Lang bared, no question. The other was rougher, older, face mapped with scars, eyes narrow and cold as creek water in winter. Silas lay nearby. Wrists bound, shirt bloodied, one eye swollen shut. Eunice's breath caught. "You think she'll come?" the scarred man asked, poking at the fire. Lang chuckled. "Oh, she'll come. She's dumb enough to think this is love. All pigs are soft." The other man laughed. "Ain't she the baker now? Might bring us a pie." Silas stirred, groaning. Eunice felt her pulse slam. She ducked lower, circling wide through the brush until she reached a higher perch. From there she could see Silas more clearly, his face pale, but his chest rising steady. She counted the steps between her and them. 23. Her fingers brushed the rifle strapped to her back. She closed one eye, steadied the barrel. The branch beneath her snapped. Both men stood instantly, guns drawn. Eunice bolted downhill, ducking behind a rock as shots rang out. Bark splintered near her face. She rolled, dirt in her mouth, chest heaving. "Come on out, sweetheart," Lang called. "We just want a little talk." She didn't answer. "You really think he's worth it?" the scarred man shouted. "A Baird choosing you. You're a joke." Something in her snapped. She rose fast, rifle up. She fired. The bullet hit the scarred man in the leg. He howled, falling into the fire. Flames licked at his coat as he screamed, rolling. Lang cursed, fired wildly into the brush. Eunice ducked, rolled again, her arm scraping stone. Another shot grazed her shoulder, the pain lancing sharp and hot. She gritted her teeth, forced her body forward. Silas shouted her name. She reached him, dropped to her knees, and pulled the knife from her belt. Cut the ropes in 2 quick slashes. He sagged into her. "Get up," she rasped. "We're going." "I told you to stay safe," he said, blinking blood from his eye. "Shut up and run." They stumbled through the trees, her blood hot down her sleeve, his breath ragged. Behind them, Lang shouted, but the wood swallowed his voice. They didn't stop. Not for the branches that slapped their faces, not for the roots that tripped them, not for the ache in their bones. Only when the moon stood high did they collapse behind a ridge, hidden beneath a fallen log. Eunice's body shook. Her arm throbbed. Silas touched her face gently. "You got shot," he said, horrified. "It's not bad," she lied. "I've burned worse baking." He started to protest, but she kissed him. Not softly, fierce, tasting blood and dirt and survival. "I will not bury you," she whispered into his mouth. "Do you hear me? I already buried too much of my life." He wrapped his arms around her. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And she believed him. They stayed hidden for 2 days. She cleaned her wound with creek water. Silas boiled roots he found for tea. He held her when the fever came and didn't let go. Not once. He told her about the ambush, how Lang had waited while he checked the traps, how they'd knocked him cold, dragged him like a calf, laughing the whole time. How they said she'd forget him eventually. "Fools," Eunice muttered, leaning against his chest. On the 3rd morning, they rode again, through valley and ridge, through pine-dark hollows and yellow meadows. Past dead fences and forgotten cabins, they found a town nestled quiet between hills, a place with no questions and fewer names. They bartered bread for nails, honey for blankets, hired an old carpenter to help repair a collapsed roof on the shack they claimed near a creek. There was no sign. Not yet, but there would be. And Eunice knew, as surely as the scar on her shoulder, that they hadn't escaped forever. Still that night, as Silas read aloud from a water-damaged almanac and she shaped dough in the firelight, they weren't afraid. Not of men, not of ghosts, not of what might come. That night, as she placed the sign above the new door, the rising loaf, Eunice saw a figure at the tree line, watching, waiting, a feather tied to his saddle. When Edric Baird rode into St. Maribel, he came dressed in black, with his last son's name still on his tongue, like a threat. The days before his arrival had passed like honey over hot bread, slow, golden, and deceptively sweet. The townsfolk of St. Maribel had begun to linger longer around the windows of the rising loaf, drawn by the smell of yeast and sugar, but kept coming back because something inside that little bakery made them feel less alone. Eunice had started to remember people's names. Silas had learned to fix the stovepipe without swearing. Even Whiskey, older now, had taken to lying in the doorway, tail thumping when customers approached. But that morning, before the hooves sounded on the hard-packed road, Silas found something at the edge of the porch. A feather. Not just any feather. A white plume tied with red twine and slipped beneath a loose board, like a message sent by wind and warning. Silas picked it up slowly, turning it in his hand like it might bite. "They found us," he said. Eunice stared at it, eyes flat, unmoved. "I know," she said. "I've been waiting." The townsfolk didn't know what was coming. Not yet. But the air changed. Folks started speaking a little softer, holding doors a little longer. Eunice noticed a hammer left on her counter by the carpenter's boy. The schoolteacher gave her extra jam without charge. Father Malden, who never wasted breath, lingered after picking up his bread order and said simply, You've got friends here now." Silas didn't ask her to leave. Eunice didn't pack. Instead, she polished the counters and lined the tins with parchment. She kept the coffee warm and her rifle loaded. Both always within reach. Every action she took was steady, slow, deliberate, like a storm preparing for its own defense. It was midday when the Bairds arrived. 6 riders in all, each astride fine horses, coats pressed and dustless, boots black and polished like mirrors. They didn't belong to the land. They hovered above it, like vultures waiting for something to die. At their head was Lang, his grin thin and sunless. His face still bore the faint traces of the firelight scar, though time had dulled its edges. Behind him, as regal and hollow-eyed as a man could be, rode Edric Baird. He hadn't changed. His suit was still spotless, his gaze still sharp as a branding iron. He rode like a judge arriving at a trial that didn't need witnesses. When they reached the bakery, the town square emptied like water down a drain. Shop doors clicked shut. Curtains twitched. Even the old drunk who usually slept by the well found somewhere else to be. Eunice had already stepped onto the porch. She wore a clean apron, sleeves rolled, hands empty. Silas stood beside her. Lang spat into the dirt. Didn't think pigs knew how to run bakeries. Eunice didn't blink. Didn't think cowards traveled 6 to 1. Edric dismounted without a word. His boots hit the dirt with a finality that made the world go quiet. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. "I gave you time," he said, his voice smooth and brittle. "Time to come home. Time to correct your mistake." Silas's jaw worked. His hand hovered near the rifle propped against the wall. "She's not a mistake," he said. Edric turned his eyes toward Eunice. His gaze moved over her like she was livestock, cataloging flaws, assessing weight. "She's nothing," he said coldly. "A stain. This place, this life, it's beneath you." Eunice took one step forward. The boards creaked beneath her boots. "I've scrubbed blood from my porch," she said, voice even. "I've dug lead out of my arm. I've watched men ride off thinking they broke me. I've faced wild boars, bullets, and your best attempt at shame." She pointed toward the sign above the door. The words, "The Rising Loaf," carved by Silas himself. "You want to fight?" she asked. "Then shoot me. Right here, in front of this sign, in front of your son, in front of a town that knows me now not as a joke, but as Eunice Calderon Baird. Owner of the finest damn bakery between here and the Rio." Lang barked a laugh. "You think anyone here's gonna stop us?" Eunice didn't move. "No," she said, "but I will." Behind her, the door creaked open. One by one, the townsfolk emerged. The widow with the limp held her walking stick like a club. The carpenter's apprentice stood with a hammer in his fist. The schoolteacher, eyes fierce behind her glasses, had a shotgun crooked in one arm. Even the sheriff, Silver Star dulled with age, stepped up with his rifle lowered, but loaded. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply stood there, a half-moon behind Eunice, silent and unyielding. Edric's eyes narrowed. "You want a war?" Eunice asked. No one answered. She took another step forward, the breeze lifting a strand of her hair. The smell of baking clung to her clothes, warm yeast and cinnamon, and something more ancient, something defiant. Edric turned to Silas. "You'll lose everything," he said. "The land, the name, the money." Silas didn't hesitate. "I already gained more than that," he said. "I gained her." The words hung in the air like a bell toll. Lang shifted in his saddle, his grin now tight and uncertain. Edric stared at his son for a long, bitter moment. Then he turned to Lang. "This town's not worth the blood," he said. Lang opened his mouth, but whatever he might have argued died beneath the weight of his father's stare. "Mount up," Edric said. And just like that, they turned and rode off, swallowed by the dust and dusk, their silhouettes shrinking with each breath. Eunice exhaled slow. The townsfolk stayed a moment longer, then began to disperse. Some clapped her shoulder, some nodded. None spoke loud, but every eye held something near reverence. Back inside, Silas poured them coffee. The same tin mugs, the same cracked enamel. They sat on the porch together, shoulder to shoulder, the evening settling in like a long sigh. "You did that," Silas said, eyes on the road. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "We did." She returned to her oven without a word, the scent of cinnamon and warm butter rising behind her like a benediction. And this time, the name on the door stayed unmarred in the wind. They reached St. Maribel just after dawn, bloodied, starving, rain-drenched, and still holding hands. The road behind them had vanished into mist and pine. Every ridge crossed felt like a goodbye. Every mile from Dry Creek Junction stole away the parts of themselves that weren't meant to be kept: shame, smallness, and the ghosts of a town that forgot how to love its own. Ahead, the peaks thinned, the trees opened like a gate, and there it was. St. Maribel, cradled in a bend of two hills, hidden beneath a sky too pale to be angry. Eunice had passed through once as a girl, riding with her mother in a wagon full of preserves they hoped to trade. Her mother had whispered then, "Places named after saints have healing in their soil." She hadn't understood it then. She did now. The town was quiet, modest. No more than a dozen buildings sloped down a crooked main path. A chapel with a leaning steeple, a shuttered feed store, and a small aging bakery that hadn't served a soul in years. Its windows boarded, its sign half-rotted, the ghost of a cinnamon swirl still painted on its door. They rode slow, not because of fear, but because they had nothing left to run from. The shack they found at the north edge of town was half-collapsed, its roof open to the sky. The chimney still stood, though, and the stone hearth inside was intact. There was a well not far off, and a grove of pine where deer tracks crossed soft soil. "It's got bones," Silas said, dismounting. "Rotted bones," Eunice replied, "but standing." She looked at the shack, hands on her hips, then nodded once. "We'll need windows," she said, "and an oven. A proper one." "We'll build it," he answered, like it had never been in question. The first night, they slept on blankets laid across the floor, the fire sputtering in the old hearth. Whiskey curled against her legs, and Silas curled around her back. There were no words, no promises, just breath and warmth and the rain tapping steady on the roof's broken ribs. At dawn, she woke before him, stepped outside barefoot. The creek sang nearby, water clear and fast over stone. Wild onions grew along the bank. She stooped, picked a handful, and breathed deep. For the first time in years, the world didn't feel like it was holding her at arm's length. It felt like it was waiting. She turned as Silas stepped outside, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Morning, Mrs. Baird," she smiled. "You hungry?" "Starving." "Then let's build a damn bakery." The days that followed were hard, but they were theirs. Silas scavenged lumber from a half-burned barn 2 miles out. Eunice dug up clay to patch the stove, rolled dough with a broken bottle. She stitched blankets from feed sacks, hunted rabbits with a slingshot, bartered wild honey for nails. He read to her by lantern light, pages torn from a water-damaged almanac someone left behind in the chapel's pew. They burned their hands, splintered their fingers, laughed when the chimney smoked backward and smoked out 3 batches of bread. But every board they nailed down, every pan they scraped clean, was an act of quiet defiance. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They were trying to survive with beauty. One morning, Eunice caught her reflection in the creek. Not thinner, not younger, but fuller somehow. Her face held something it hadn't in years: light. Silas called her name, and she turned, and he looked at her like she was sacred. It wasn't passion like novels talked about. It was steadier, deeper. It was choosing, again and again, even when it hurt. And it did hurt. The scar on her arm stiffened in the cold. His shoulder ached from the blow Lang had dealt weeks before. They bore their pain like medals. Late one night, they made love beneath the stars, a blanket spread over flattened grass, pine scent in the air. It wasn't practiced or pretty, but it was true. Two people laying down their scars long enough to say, "I am yours," without needing the words. They fell asleep like that, tangled and breathing slow, her head on his chest. In the morning, she baked with more care than she'd ever dared. Sourdough, gingerbread, small tarts with a glaze of boiled jam. He built the door frame, carved a sign, sanded the wood smooth. He painted the words himself, "The Rising Loaf." When she saw it hung, her throat caught. "This is it," she whispered. "It's real." He took her hand. "We're real." Word spread in St. Maribel faster than gossip had any right to. First came the hungry children, then a widow from the chapel, then a pair of farmhands who hadn't tasted warm bread since winter. By the 7th day, a woman from the church asked for the cinnamon roll recipe. Eunice gave it freely. They didn't talk about Dry Creek. They didn't mention the Bairds. But some things don't need speaking to be heard. Late one afternoon, as she cooled loaves on the windowsill, a rider appeared, dust-covered, road-worn. He didn't dismount, just stood at the edge of the clearing, horse shifting beneath him. Eunice stepped outside, rifle in hand. The rider removed his hat. Lang. His eyes were red-rimmed but dry. They locked gazes across the yard. He said nothing. Neither did she. Then he turned, rode off, left the town the same way he'd come, in silence. That night, Eunice sat with Silas on the porch. They shared a slice of honey pie. The porch boards creaked beneath their weight, the air sweet with rising dough. Her stitches had healed. His lip was no longer swollen, but something lingered in the quiet between them. "You afraid he'll come back?" Silas asked. She watched the stars blink into view above the hills. "No," she said. He saw what he needed to. "What's that?" She looked at him, steady. "That I'm not running anymore." Silas reached for her hand. "You're the toughest woman I've ever met," she smirked. "I've killed a boar, baked bread in a fire pit, and shot a man for you. You better appreciate that." "Oh, I do," he said, drawing her closer. "Every damn day." The wind passed through the trees, soft as a hymn. They sat until long after the coals went out. The world, once cruel, was finally quiet. And this time, it was theirs. She watched Caleb laugh with a child over spilled jam, watched the sun stream in through their windows, and felt the final stone of doubt fall from her heart. She was no one's shame, no man's mistake, no town's punchline. She was the woman he chose, and more importantly, she was the woman who chose herself later that night as the stars blinked to life, and the scent of bread faded into the cool air. Martha sat on the porch with Caleb beside her, his hand in hers. "Think they'll come back?" he asked. "They might," she said. "And if they do," she smiled, "then I'll bake something special with a touch of cinnamon and a whole lot of vengeance." He laughed, head tipped back to the stars. The world once so cruel was finally quiet. And this time, she knew it was hers. Some stories don't end with gunfire or applause, but with the soft scrape of a bread knife and a door left gently open to the breeze. And if you listen close enough, you'll still hear the wind carrying the scent of cinnamon through the hills of St. Maribel. A name carved in pine above a worn door can outlast bullets and bloodlines, and a woman once forgotten by a town can become the stone others stand upon. There's a kind of justice that doesn't wear a badge or make noise. It bakes slowly in a warm oven and hands itself out with calloused fingers, one slice at a time. Eunice Calderon never asked for reverence, never begged for mercy, never once pleaded for a name to protect her. But she gave warmth to those who had none, steadiness to a man who once wore chains of inheritance, and courage to a town that had forgotten how to choose its own heart. The world didn't change with thunder. It changed with quiet refusals, with bread kneaded by a scarred arm, with a rifle held by someone who'd rather not fire it, but wouldn't hesitate if the truth was on the line. Folks may forget what you wore or what you looked like in the end, but they remember how you made them feel when you handed them something warm in the cold, when you stood without apology in front of the storm. Silas Baird never inherited his father's empire, but he found something far richer. He learned that freedom comes not from land deeds or legacies, but from waking beside someone who sees you as enough. And Lang, for all his fury, rode back into the dusk with nothing in his saddlebag but silence, having faced something he could neither mock nor destroy, a woman whose strength wasn't given, but earned. The shutters in St. Maribel still rattle when the wind comes down from the pass, and folks say you can smell cloves and baked sugar whenever the sky turns gold before a storm. They say the woman in the bakery never raised her voice, but never once bowed her head. And maybe that's what we're left with, not a tale of vengeance, but a recipe for enduring. A cracked flour tin that still holds sweetness, a scorched letter kept not out of bitterness, but as a reminder that some promises break, but we still go on. A tin mug passed between two tired hands at dusk. The sound of a horse moving slow through pine needles. A dress sewn from curtains, worn like armor. The faint sound of laughter from a porch light still burning. In a world that tried to shrink her, she expanded. In a story that had written her out, she rewrote it with sugar, smoke, and steel. So if you ever pass through a town with no name on your map, and you see a sign swaying in the wind that reads "The Rising Loaf," stop and take in the smell. Remember the woman who wasn't supposed to win. Remember that honor can be buried, but not erased. Justice may come late, but it still matters. Kindness may start in the hands of a forgotten woman, but it can ripple like the bells of an old chapel on a still morning. And truth doesn't need applause. It only needs one soul brave enough to live by it. If this tale stirred something in you, something slow and good and aching with memory, then leave behind a sign, a comment, a shared name. Let us know you still believe that bread can rise, that people can change, that dignity outlasts cruelty. Subscribe to hear the next story, told in the glow of twilight. And may you always find your way back to the quiet places, where the fire still burns low, the door stays open, and there's always a slice waiting for someone who needs it.